All right, hello everyone. So this week we're going to look at Roman sustainability, and some of this will look familiar to you because we're looking at some of the same data sources in terms of pollen and erosion data. First of all, I just want to give you a little brief overview of what was happening just as agriculture gets a really good foothold in northern Italy. And the dates here are 3600 to 3170 before present. And of course, that's 1650 to 1250 about BC. When you look at the pollen data, it shows that there are forests here. Now, just like we've looked at with the Greeks and the Egyptians, with settlements come a decrease in tree pollen. And that makes sense because what's happening is they are cutting down trees to build buildings, to have fires, to do lots of other things. And you can look at various sites around Italy and see that some of them you can find thousands of wooden poles. Sorry, that's my cat. And what this shows, along with the pollen counts, is that there's extensive deforestation. So they're cutting down the trees. And of course, at the same time, you see an increase in cereal pollen. So they're growing grains. And you see an increase in fodder pollen, which is the material that people grow to feed animals. And then you also see an increase in grape pollen. And at the times, and we've seen this before in Greece and in Rome, you see an increase in tree pollen when you see a decrease in settlements. So when something's happening to the human population, tree growth comes back. Okay, so we have looked at quite a bit of deforestation information, with the Egyptians and the Greeks, and of course during the Neolithic period, it's the exact same thing that's happening with the Romans. So as you see an increase in their population levels, you see an increase in deforestation. And I've given you some dates here. So as early as the 300s BC, which is during the Roman Republic, you see an increase in tree cutting. Now, if you remember, especially if you're talking about hills, you cut down the trees and then you get erosion. So the water that's falling from rain can't get a grip on the soil because the roots aren't there, and it floods down into the plain. So you certainly see this. And we see an increase in flooding during the 1st century BC as well. And that's probably because of deforestation. So one interesting impact that this happened, or that occurred in Rome during this period, was that the amazing town of Ostia, which was sitting right on the Tiber River in the Mediterranean, was really abandoned during this period because of silt built up. So silt is, almost like the same thing that was happening in Egypt, where silt is coming down the river. Now in Egypt, they actually use that to grow their plants. For the Tiber River, it had to be dug out. And the Romans just couldn't dig it out because of so much silt was coming down the river from erosion. So Ostia was abandoned. Okay, now I've taken this out of an article I've asked you to read early on in the course titled Deforestation, Mosquitoes in Ancient Rome, Lessons for Today. And it's got a really good chart on page 757 about what happens when you cut down trees. And again, some of this, let me see if I can get my pen, we've looked at this. So you've got deforestation happening here. That a lot of things happen because of that. So increased runoff of water, that leads to increased river flooding, and then of course an increase in soil erosion. You also get a rise in the water table, which doesn't help farming. What you get is an increased swamp area, or in this case, what this chart shows is marshes. And you can't grow a lot of things in this period or in this area. And then of course what you also get is an increase in silting, which we just talked about, which if you're looking at marine environments, it leads to a decrease in salinity. So you get a change in the marine environment. And I gave you an article a couple of weeks ago that looked at this very thing that was happening in Egypt in the Delta region with either an increased salinity when the river was not flooding or a decrease in salinity when you've got heavy water flows. Now, of course, the rest of this chart is really about the increase in mosquito levels, which of course leads to an increase in disease. So it's an interesting impact on sustainability. When you cut down the trees, especially in this area, it leads to human disease. Okay, and then here's an erosion data table, which is very similar to what we've looked at before. Now, let me see, for some reason my pen isn't quite working. Let me see if I can get this to work better. So this is the period we really want to focus on right now. So this is during the Roman Republic, and if you look across this line here, so what you've got are pollen counts here. So this is overall tree pollen. And then you see this big rise in the OJCV, which we've talked about before. And if you look over here, you see the same thing here, and then keep going. Look right here. We don't need to worry about the demography, but look at this increase in erosion here. So all of this is related to cutting down trees. And I've given you some data here, what's happening in northeastern Italy. You see an increase in erosion during this period, and then of course you get more flooding, and then certainly after that. Now in western central Italy, you have this table that I just showed you, which shows the corresponding pollen counts along with erosion data. Okay, we do know that the Romans attempted to save their soil because they knew it was important for growing crops. So there's a lot of different things that they did, and I only list a few things here. So intercropping, what this is you have, say, grapevines grown, and then you put other plants in between the grapevines to preserve the soil and fertilize the soil and so on. We know that they left some areas empty or fallow. So you would get, 2 years of growing crops and then 1 year of not growing crops, and that leads to an increase in soil fertility. And then we also know that they knew about crop rotation. So these days, in the modern period, what you don't want to do is to plant tomatoes in the same spot over and over and over again, or potatoes. So what you have to do is plant tomatoes in one spot, and then the next year move them to a different area, move them to a different area the following year, and you can bring them back in year 3 or year 4. And the Romans knew all about crop rotation and how that would actually help preserve the soil. A really good article is by White titled Fallowing, Crop Rotation and Crop Yields in Roman Times. You can look that up at the library, but it has a ton of primary sources, so it's actually a really good article on these 3 topics. Okay, I've got quite a bit of, speaking of primary sources, quite a bit of primary source here that I'm not going to read to you. So very early on in the Roman Republic, we've got a man named Cato the Elder. He wrote a book called On Agriculture. And there's some it's a long text, but there's some really interesting parts that talk about various things. So like in 1.7, what he talks about is the ideal farm, like the best kind of farm. And he talks about, it should be about 66 acres, lots of soils, should have a place with a vineyard. And what he's really doing is helping people with buying advice. So if you're out to buy a farm, this is what you should look for. Now, we haven't talked about this in this class, but there are slaves during the Roman period, and he talks about, a farm this size really needs about 16 enslaved people to work it. And then what you should do here is pause the video and then read through this. And what this is really about is talking about manure, the type of trees to plant, and why you would plant these type of trees. So go ahead and pause the video, read through it, and then move to the next slide. Okay, and then on this slide, we've got more information on what type of fertilizers he would use for putting on crops. So pigeon dung, where you'd put it. He wants you to save goat, sheep, cattle, and other types of dung. And then also, as well as manure, there are crops that you can use. So this is where intercropping comes in as well. So different types of beans and hairy vetch, if you've ever seen it, it's a beautiful plant. You can still get it today for doing cover crops. It has a nice purple flower. And then again, this is quite a bit of information. I showed a bit of this slide when I was talking about the Greeks, where I had mentioned that Cato had said there were quite a few Greeks that wrote about agriculture. So go ahead and pause the video and read through this. Okay, we also have Varro, who wrote a little bit after Cato. He also wrote a book titled On Agriculture. It's a fascinating text. I wish we had time to go through this because it's a different topic. But the very beginning of his On Agriculture, he talks about his wife buying her own estate, her own farm. And then what he ends up doing through this text is giving her advice on how to run it. So he starts off with the religious aspects, um, and then he also knew that cattle could help with manure. So they were really big on trying to preserve the soil if they could. And then you also have another man named Lucretius, writing about the same time. He was a Roman poet, and he wrote a lot of interesting things on the interplay between nature and people, nature and the Romans. And one thing he wrote about was that war is the opposite of agriculture, which of course is true because in the Roman period, like in the Greek and other periods, soldiers would go out and destroy crops to hurt their enemy. Now, Lucretius saw war, as I put here, as an excess desire for things of what people already have. So he wanted to balance this all out so that people didn't have this desire for excess. And it was really interesting, too, if you're interested in historiography, which is the history of writing history. During this period, lots of Roman writers talked about how greed and the desire for other things led to the downfall of the Republic. And Lucretius is part of that. Okay, in the last couple slides, I just want to talk about the grain trade. So when you read sources about Roman grain, sometimes it's referred to corn, referred to as corn. And a lot of British writers in the modern times would say the corn crop. Now, they don't mean corn like corn on the cob. What they mean is wheat. So if you see something about Roman corn, don't think that it's the corn because at this point there is no corn on the cob in Europe during this time. This comes from Central and South America much later. So just as a word of warning, if you read corn and Roman in the same sentence, they're talking about grain and usually wheat. In terms of what's going on in history, so in the second century BC, you've got the Romans really spreading out at this point and gaining lots of land through war. Now, what this leads to, and I just hinted at this with Lucretius, is that it brought a demand for luxury goods. So people started having more money because they had larger farms and it was bringing in more money for the state. What you see, though, is a population increase, and then food prices increase because Rome starts not being able to grow enough food for itself. And then you've got all the civil wars that are happening during the first century BC that really disrupted agriculture, not only because soldiers were trampling over farmland, but the actual farmers became soldiers. So they were being dragged away at all times of the year when they should have been at home working in their fields, growing the crops. Now, ultimately, what this ends up doing is forcing the Roman state, especially when you get to what's referred to as the empire, when you have Augustus, the first emperor, he takes over the grain trade. So, and partly this is happening because of all these civil wars disrupting agriculture, but because you also have a famine. And famines are terrible if you're trying to run a government because people are unhappy and they want a change in government. So you have to keep people fed. And so what Augustus ends up doing is taking control of the grain trade. And then what they end up doing is importing massive amounts of grain into Rome and the surrounding areas to feed people. Because what they ended up doing is giving free bread out to the Roman, free grain, depending on what area we're talking about. A lot of this grain is coming from Sicily, so at the southern part of Italy, North Africa, and of course Egypt. We also see this big increase in olive oil imports, which really hurts sort of the farmers on Italy. Sorry, my phone just clicked. As I mentioned, what this ends up doing is the Roman government had to develop a way to bring all this in reliably. And what you get is a very sophisticated trading system to get the grain and the oil and all these other luxury goods into Rome. Now, what they ended up doing, and you have to think about where this is all coming from, it's really sea-based. Not a lot of it did not come from land because it was really expensive to travel by land and the whole thing. The Romans could build very large ships. And so a lot of this is sea-based. And so what what normally happened is that all of these ships would land near Ostia. And I just talked about how Ostia had silted up during the first century AD and they stopped using it. But before this, they built really large granaries at Ostia. And then they traveled or they took the grain up into Rome from there. Now, in this last slide, what I really want you to think about is the sustainability part of this. So it's interesting to know that they had to bring in grain from all these different areas, but what does this mean for the land and the environment? So you can think about Egypt in particular. So we've already looked at Egypt and how farming is really dependent on the Nile. So think about the human effort, the amount of people that were needed to grow all of this grain to feed the Romans. Now, what normally happened is that if the Romans wanted grain, then the Egyptians would have to stop growing certain things to make room for the grain. So crops that are normally grown are replaced with that. And then think about transport. So you obviously have the Nile. So you can transport that by sailing grain up the Nile into the grain ports at Alexandria, which would then be shipped off to Italy. You do get overland trade, but of course this has to happen at certain time points. So it has to happen after the harvest and before the annual flooding because a lot of times the roads were then flooded over. So there's only certain times of the year when you can have overland transport of grain. We also know that they used pack animals, so donkeys and so on, which of course needed to be fed and they needed to be taken care of and so on. And then of course you have to think about the government, the whole setup guided by Rome through Roman traders, Egyptian traders and so on, and to how to get this grain from Egypt into Rome. Now, when you've got good years of flooding of the Nile, everything is just fine because you can grow all this different food. Now think about what happens when the Nile doesn't flood. And you know, when we are talking about Egypt throughout Egyptian history, when the Nile doesn't flood, it brings the government down. So think about what would happen in Rome if you have the Nile not flooding or over flooding and then causing impacts on the grain trade. So what you end up getting, no big surprise, is problems in Rome with people being hungry. And then they usually attack the government and it causes all types of issues related to sustainability. Now, next week, what we're going to look at are some specific examples. So we'll look at some lumber trading by the Romans. We'll look at mining and the impacts that has on the environment and so on.